Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Erin Fletcher, the Director of Interpretation and Adult Programming at the Cleveland Museum of Art. I'm so pleased you can join us for this afternoon's lecture, Shahzia Sikander, Multivalence. This is the Fran and Warren Rupp Distinguished Lecture on Contemporary Art. This lecture provides regional audiences with direct access to programs by practicing contemporary artists at the museum. We're deeply grateful for the vision of the donors and all donors who support education so the museum can offer programs like this to audience members like you. Before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping things. Please take a minute to silence your cell phones if you haven't already to prevent any disruptions during today's talk. For your awareness, the back 2 rows of the first floor of this auditorium are for our visitors with mobility challenges, so I ask that you please leave those open. Now, I'd like to begin today's event with the museum's Indigenous Peoples and Land Acknowledgement, which was written in collaboration with the CMA Native American Advisory Committee. The Cleveland Museum of Art acknowledges the many Indigenous peoples who have been dispossessed from this region. For millennia, they occupied, traversed, lived from, and cared for land and waterways in Ohio. Today, Native Americans of diverse ancestries and tribal affiliations continue to reside in Northeast Ohio, sustaining their heritages, beliefs, and practices, and making contributions to our region's life and vitality. With this statement, we affirm our commitment to creating respectful, enduring, and collaborative relationships with them and with the Native artists and communities represented by works in our collection, which embody knowledge and traditions passed down through the generations. After the lecture today, I'd like to invite you to join us for a public reception in the banquet room from 3 o'clock to 4:30 p.m. If you haven't already, I hope you will also take a moment to see Ms. Sikander's work on display in our New Narratives Contemporary Works on Paper exhibit, which is on display in the James and Hannah Bartlett Prints and Drawings galleries. This exhibit will be on view until April 14th, 2024. We also look forward to a survey exhibition of Ms. Sikander's artwork, which will be co-organized by the Cleveland Museum of Art and the Cincinnati Art Museum, and will open at the Palazzo Soranzo Van Axel in Venice in April 2024. To introduce our speaker this afternoon, I'd like to invite Dr. Emily Liebert, CMA's Curator of Contemporary Art, to the podium. Emily joined the museum in 2017 and has since curated a number of important exhibitions by artists such as Carrie James Marshall, Julie Meritou, Raul de Nieves, and Laura Owens. She also organized the group exhibition Picturing Motherhood Now and CMA's first site-specific commission in the atrium, Ama, the Gathering Place by Emeka Ogbo in 2019. She's also expanded the CMA's contemporary collection through acquisitions of artwork by artists such as Emma Amos, Jenny Holzer, Rashid Johnson, Teresa Margolles, and many others. Please help me welcome Emily Liebert.
Thank you, Erin. Good afternoon and welcome. I am greatly looking forward to spending the afternoon together as we hear from the trailblazing artist Shahzia Sikander. Before I say more about that, I would like to echo Erin's gratitude to Fran and Warren Rupp for their vision in endowing the lecture series that brings Shahzia to Cleveland today, and I also want to thank Erin and her colleague Cameron McConnell for all of their work putting together today's lecture. I first encountered Shahzia Sikander's work in 2002 in the celebrated exhibition at MoMA, Drawing Now, 8 Propositions. I was immediately struck by the way that Shahzia reframes the past through the lens of the present and inspires us to think about our own moment in history through the traditions that precede us. As she transports us through time and place, Shahzia invites us to see differently the world we inhabit and reimagine the possibilities in our midst. Since my initial encounter with Shahzia's work 20+ years ago, I have followed her artistic practice with great admiration. I've been inspired by the bold and inventive ways she translates her ideas across a wide array of mediums, as well as different scales, moving between the miniature and the fully immersive environment. I've also relished watching Shahzia's distinctive vocabulary of forms grow and gain force over time. Given my great esteem for Shahzia's work, I feel deeply privileged and honored to be curating a show with Shahzia right now. The Cleveland Museum of Art, as Aaron mentioned, is co-organizing with the Cincinnati Art Museum Shahzia Sikander Collective Behavior. After the exhibition premieres in Venice, Italy this spring, complementary iterations will come home to Cleveland and to Cincinnati. The CMA's presentation will open in the Julia and Larry Pollock Focus Gallery in early 2025. In that setting, Shahzia's art will be in conversation with historic works from the CMA's distinguished South Asian collection that inspire the artist. I can't wait to share this collaboration with all of you, and I'm so pleased that this is the first of many times that we will be able to gather together around Shahzia's work in the months and years ahead. Shahzia's accomplishments and accolades are too numerous to list comprehensively, but I will name a few that highlight the global scope of the recognition that she's received. Her work has been exhibited internationally with major solo exhibitions at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the Asia Society in Hong Kong, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Morgan Library in New York, and most recently also in New York at the Madison Square Park Conservancy. Shahzia's work is in public and private collections worldwide, and she is the recipient of numerous awards, among them the prestigious John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Fellowship Genius Award, as well as the Pollock Prize for Creativity and the Fukuoka Arts and Culture Prize. After today's lecture with Shahzia, there will be a brief period for questions and answers, followed by the reception that Aaron mentioned. I know this afternoon we are in for a great treat, and so now, without further delay, I would like to welcome Shahzia Sikander to the podium.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. Such an honor for me to be here in Cleveland, and super excited to work together for these upcoming projects and to share my work today. I think through my hand. Drawing has been an integral part of my art. Drawing allows thinking to take place. It creates an armature of research, clarification of ideas, and it connects thinking to gesture, to action, to practice. It allows collaboration to foster. For example, for many of my animated works, I'm also thinking about drawing as the libretto. I have been drawing since I was a child. The early memories are of creating scrapbooks, happily doing art homework of my siblings, cousins, biology maps, math charts, geography maps, class projects, to making detailed portraits of friends. I found emotional freedom in visual expression. I was born in Pakistan, and I grew up in a joint family, multiple generation home, with grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins, siblings, parents. I was quiet. I used drawing early on as a tool of communication. Drawing implies movement in time. Space, velocity, magnitude, direction, all essential elements inherent in the process of drawing, they become active in different ways through thought and action, through animation and music, through painting and sculpture, through reading and writing. I also came of age during the military dictatorship in Pakistan in the 1980s. There was a cultural shift happening as Cold War dynamics dictated shifting alliances and superpowers, humanitarian crisis, diminishing human rights, sanctions, etc. Afghan-Pak US-Soviet war unfolding in the region marked by diminishing women's rights in Pakistan. I was inspired by women all around me. Activists, artists, poets, female friends. In 1987, I enrolled at the National College of Arts in NCA. It wasn't that I wanted to study art, it was more that I wanted to be among creative thinkers that were engaged in dissent and pushing back at the closing in of cultural spaces. My interest in pre-modern manuscripts was sparked at that time in the mid-1980s when abstract expressionism was prevalent in art schools, including Pakistan. No one was studying miniature painting, and these distinctions towards high art and low art were quite extreme. That reminds me of the show Magicians of the World, which was at the Pompidou, that in the late 80s was getting a lot of discussion. So being one of the first students at the National College of Arts to develop a very intense mentorship with the master teacher, Bashir Ahmed, I also wanted to delve into the discipline's history, technique, and styles. Copying historical examples was part of the training. At the National College of Arts, students had little access to original works because also that was due to the legacy of colonialism. Most South and Central Asian manuscript illustrations reside in Western museums. So my first visual encounter was with the facsimile of the original. And that, for me, is a very interesting conceptual premise. So, for example, this might be how the miniature looked at me till later when I was able to look at the actual, I was able to see it in clarity. And, this is an important point because we talk about cultural authenticity and nation-based ownership of who owns what and how art history is constructed, but also this is something that was my experience, that the actual manuscript objects were mostly outside of Pakistan. And I'm not talking about India, but definitely growing up in Pakistan. So, for example, even the incredible objects, South Asian art, historical art, that's at the Cleveland Art Museum. So just to sort of keep that in perspective. But the commitment that I gained towards the manuscript tradition, it also stems from my desire to diversify a predominantly Eurocentric art history and to question the entrenched organizing principles of museums with regard to what is contemporary or historical. So that inherent eroticism and beauty that I found even while looking at the reproductions that were often in the few books that were circulating in the 80s, catalogs organized by Howard Hodgkin's collection, for example, the book on his collection of Indian paintings, or anything at the British Library or the V&A, any particular books. This is pre-internet time, so of course it's a very different time of how information was shared. And recently just realizing that so much, or maybe all of the collections that are at the Cleveland Art Museum, Cleveland Museum of Art, they are online and they have been digitized and available and accessible to a lot of students, especially in the Global South, in high resolution like that. That was not part of my youth. In terms of the work that I did as a young artist at the National College of Arts, there was this painting called The Scroll, which was, in which also the outlier that was emerging in my work was this female. And it's a young female woman stepping over a threshold, which is symbolized as a frame, where she takes herself and others, the viewer, into a journey, into an epic poem, possibly through a contemporary home or a historical Safavid painting. So I was looking at the Safavid traditions, painterly traditions, and not just Western contemporary art. I wanted to sort of go back further in time and history and go past the 19th century scholarship around manuscript painting. So this form of this female is hovering in this space in a restless, diaphanous manner between the familiar and the unfamiliar, passing through time but not being rooted in the moment that the other characters exist within. The young adult female defies bodily restrictions by becoming an elastic, transparent, moving form, a ghost-like character. And in the last section, the girl rendered in transparent white, devoid of color, offers a self-portrait, a triangular relationship with herself. Whose portrait is she looking at? Neither she nor the viewer can see her face. So the painting was a turning point in Pakistan, launching contemporary miniature and laying to rest the national debate about traditional miniature traditions' inability to engage the youth. So I had started researching this work in 1987, 88, and I may have been breaking boundaries in Pakistan as a young artist, but in 1993, when I was in the US doing my MFA, I was seen as a traditional artist, when neither historical nor contemporary miniature painting was familiar internationally in the art world. It was because my work was engaging pictorial traditions that did not sit comfortably in the lap of Western art history, that often it would get glossed over and straitjacketed in terms of my biography. Which brings me to the point that I want to make, is that my art was seen through the lens of a Pakistani, a female, a Muslim female, an artist, Asian artist, etc. first, than the work itself. And such opaque and broad projections emphasize the work as that of the other, an outsider, from another culture, robbing the work of any meaningful and critical read and instead being substituted for by often prevalent essentialist approaches to the third world. So to counter, I started deconstructing exclusionary ideas within race representations, rejecting the colonial or the male gaze, and reimagining archetypal characters to tell richer stories. In Providence, I grappled with assumptions about my identity as a Pakistani woman, often applying the sensitivity to materials that I had learned in my training and experimenting with new media and techniques with a different level of swiftness or abandonment. I started dissecting these coffee table style, big, luxurious books on Islamic art or Indian art, these sort of generic, large-scale books where there were all these categories breaking down into ceramics, weapons, calligraphy, and I thought, oh, these shadowless representations of photographs almost look like little monsters that I wanted to animate, and thus they could step out of the books into their own power. That is how some of these drawings started to emerge. That was that sort of take for me, a little bit like a humorous take on the ideas of histories of dispersion, rupturing, archiving, cataloging, institutionalizing art and artifacts of native cultures. Experimenting with ink, mixed media techniques with different levels of pressure with brush and ink, abstraction, gouache, gestural marks. They started suggesting recognizable, often figurative forms, a repertoire of iconographies that started to emerge at a time when I was creating numerous fast ink drawings, several in a week, which was quite different from having, could put all your energy into a small, detailed, notebook-sized manuscript work, which had its own method of step 1 leading into step 10 over a period of, several weeks. So I would say that in these sort of like collapse of different approaches, I started to think of alter egos, figuration, and kind of ways in which a vocabulary would emerge, which eventually I could understand as perhaps a feminist lens on the tradition of the manuscript painting. But I was also interested in the lack of female artists represented in art history, but not but also within the manuscript tradition, because so much of the attributions of who the painters may be is often male. And it was just hard to imagine that there were no women painters and why there were no attributions towards that. So this idea of drawing becoming about converting erasure into an opportunity through wit, candor, by inserting, taking the freedom as a visual artist to insert gaps in the archives. Oftentimes, I would be exploring conflicting surface tension by painting in swift gesture of almost like a graffiti over my meticulously rendered works. So it could create a disruption of surface. And sometimes it would lead to a destabilizing of a particular motif, whether it was heterosexual love, a prevalent trope in the traditional miniature, or whether it was collaboration being inserted into the space of the work itself. So there's a whole series called Uprooted series, Separate Working Things, Ready to Leave. The central characters' attempts often are to pin down the paradox of rootedness. A critical moment also came when I was selected as the core fellow at the Glassell School of Art at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, 1995 to 97, to further explore things that I was already, of interest. So Houston, a region with its own cultural dynamics and history, stimulated my creativity and dialogue with a broader spectrum of racial and diasporic communities. In Texas, I became more aware of racial complexities in the US, including African American and civil rights histories and immigrant patterns and movements, magnifying my desire to understand the other in the shifting, contentious multiplicity of the American sociocultural topography. So during this time, my work increased, wall-sized installations that combined these tracing paper drawings with layers that I was painting directly on the wall, and then putting these drawings that were transparent drawings over the wall drawings. So where traditional painting was growing, was developing a personal vocabulary, I was also exploring things that left the page, the manuscript page, and different elements or vocabularies that are in these stories, whether they are deeply entrenched gender biases in childhood storybooks, manuscript paintings, depiction of women, how they were often seen, and how I could insert a much more playful, proactive engagement of the feminine connected to the past in imaginative ways, and also to push back through a vocabulary to where the confronted categories of hyphenated identities would often be, are you Pakistani, are you Muslim, are you artist, are you a woman artist, are you an Asian American? How to push back at all those categories, but at the same time realizing that, more categories, the merrier. There was no one way. So how to be elusive and not be stuck in narrow definitions. So as opportunities to show work in New York expanded, I had my first show at the Drawing Center. I decided to move there in 1997, 98. And the focus in New York was on, again, female agency, but also developing fresh concepts soon after the events of 9/11, which affected my work deeply. Questions of wealth, class, trade, global economics, race, capitalism, they all started to percolate. So as I was negotiating a sense of belonging during this phase, I think the context of New York, or being a young artist in New York, really allowed me to think about work from a very collaborative perspective, and being able to meet like many different artists and thinkers and writers and poets and performance artists allowed like a different way of playing with the subject matter. And these are some of the early works at the Drawing Center, but paper, drawing, installation, thinking of things that were open, where everything is very visible, paper being transparent, its physicality is evident, it flows, it moves, all floors are part of the piece. It became a part of the direction that I found myself in, which the works had no borders. They could be expanded in any direction, making a site that was unstable or multivalent. It was almost like a counterpoint to the very detailed, small-scale painting practice. The intention was to use fluid, spontaneous gesture that often involved the whole body and amplified all the invented motifs. Being Asian American or Asian anything in the West often means living the paradox of being invisible while standing out. It's a broad racial category in which many different nations, ethnicities, classes, cultures, histories, communities, languages have to vie to be recognized. And though this premise has been, it feels like I've been, living in the US for so long, and New York City is my home, but it still seems like some of these issues are so topical. They were present in the 90s. They took a different force post 9/11, and then 20 years later, they are still being addressed. So I find that these cyclical themes that obviously are shifting and being challenged, but they somehow are so entrenched, they don't go away. And some of this art that I was doing early on, then recently I've had opportunity or interest to revisit it. And these are some of the examples of how the work has, when I've revisited it, how it has become larger, the scale has shifted, it's almost very theatrical. You can, there's like 5-8 feet of depth between the works, and here some views of how it's being constructed. I work very much, very fluidly with ink, and for a show that was organized recently by the Rhode Island School of Design's museum, Jan Howard, and then it traveled to Morgan Library. I was at the Morgan Library. I was asked to sort of see if some of the older works from the 90s I had access to, and much of this work I often would trade with other artists. There was an impermanence that I appreciated about it. So I thought, okay, maybe how do you revisit older work if it was so fluid and loose? So I basically recreated it, but also in dialogue with the works of mine that I had made in the early 90s and mid-90s that were in the show. And much of this work I myself was seeing after a very long time. So it was a really interesting way to look backward and think about so many themes that were in the work and what that meant in the moment in 2020. This sort of this direction of thinking about drawing, that it has this malleability and movement, that it can go across mediums, across formats, and across time, has been sort of a strength that I find in terms of like focusing on that concept and then being able to think through other time-based mediums. So my first engagement with animation started when I was doing a residency at ArtPace in San Antonio in 2001. And this is also soon after 9/11, and of course, I'm juggling these different directions simultaneously, but there was this painting that I did for New York Times, which dealt with war and coalitions, alternating friends and foes, and projecting what the next sort of millennium, it was like how artists would imagine what was around the corner. So in that sense, it was very prescient that it was 2 years before 9/11. And I thought of this topic at that time, but it was never reviewed. So it was reviewed in 2017. So again, as an artist, you know, you are often like, you create work that you think is of the moment, but then it's almost like 20 years later that it starts to connect with people. So that is something that I think of, and I think I just wanted to point that out because time is such an important topic and theme in my work. I really do think about how to capture the idea and concept of time and what does that mean. Some of these early works that you see here, you know, they then also thinking about how the work gets received or how it can, as an artist, I think it's really interesting how we think about our work versus how things get contextualized and what that means. Of course, as an older artist looking back and thinking, okay, where does the work that I've created fit in? Is it as an artist that has been making work in the US for, you know, almost 30 years and still never being part of the American canon? Like, what does that mean? Because you're not creating work in absence or outside of anything. It's happening here, but it was literally, it took the show at the Rhode Island School of Design's museum that when they curated that we were able to address these topics. They had never been talked in depth about my practice. It was always sort of just surface addressed in terms of who you were or where you were from. And what does that mean 30 years later if you're still being talked about as where you're from? So these are nebulous things, but they become fodder for my practice. And I work a lot with ink, and so drawing becomes again a process of thinking through these complexities. And these group of drawings is an ongoing work of mine that embraces uncertainty and flux. It's also constantly exploring ideas around power and powerlessness, but it's also about movement and a means of imagining and bringing forms to life. So much of this work has led to animation, and an example here, Spin, with the Mughal court manuscript paintings that were set in this court, a space like this stage or the darbar or the formal meeting space traditionally reserved for displays of authority. So here I was thinking of how to disrupt a symbol of patriarchy or sovereignty, and where the women accumulate, and as they leave the space, they leave a trace behind, and it's their hair. So thinking about iconography that is small enough that it can be thought of as a particle system, and if I thought of it as such, then I could have a code written that would allow me to have choreographed movements. So the title itself referred at that time to the idea of like these themes that keep repeating, like CNN, and generally how narrative is shaped through repetition. But that's just one example. This is another one here of things that look like butterflies, but when they would fall, when the movement stopped, you would see that it was turbans that were sitting on the figures. So it was how to play with elements that were markers of a certain type and then be able to dismantle or find ways in which to disrupt their expected narrow definition. I also had opportunities to work in Pakistan, and there's a film that I made, Bending the Barrels. And all of this kind of work, which I see very collaborative and engaged in research, was allowing me to create new works. There's a whole direction on the works I made called The Last Post and Parallax. And though I may have been looking at the manuscript traditions, but I was also equally interested in how to imagine themes that were coming about by looking at the colonial history in the subcontinent and its, of course, relationship with the greater ways of movement and how provenance of different objects functions in our understanding of history and geography. So the central figure here is this red-coated company man, which is, again, the British opium trade with China, but I'm also playing on it with the company school of painting. So looking at the aesthetic and stylistic visual histories, but then thinking about a particular historical context. So the last post narrative is also made possible by collaborating with composers. So I worked with Du Yun, based in New York, but from Shanghai, and we created this piece for Rockbund Museum in Shanghai. So collaboration started to bring about this idea of scale, space, movement, labor in different ways than just the works on paper. And here is another example of how I was tapping into that interest specifically for a piece that I did for the economics building at the Princeton University. So just wanting to show like how the broad themes are able to exist in multiple ways, in multiple dimensions, and in ways in which they situate themselves and can have multiple lives. So for example, here, the East India Company attire is on top of a portrait of Adam Smith. And here, the history of that may be noble, but we're still in the same old patterns of wealth. And this idea was like strapped with wings, but unable to fly. So just examples of how drawing is at the foundation of conceiving themes, making them, and then also finding the ability to be in different mediums. So here it's all painted on glass, and these are some of the drawings that led to that idea and the exploration. Another work that I did also was Parallax. It's a 3-channel single image video that can be presented in different scales. Sometimes, it's been shown at 75 feet or more. It was inspired by my drive journey through the landscape of the UAE, but because I was invited to create work for the Sharjah Art Biennial by Yuko Hasegawa, who I had worked with in Tokyo in 2010. So my interest was that I wanted to create a work born of my time spent there to do the research. So it's a piece made from drawings, many drawings, but also from not my studio in New York, but actually taking the team and taking the collaborator, the composer, working with poets in Sharjah. While driving across, came across a cinema where I was keen to go and in my research, came across this abandoned theater, and a guy who was there, who's photographed here, he was from Pakistan, and he had come to build the cinema in 1976 as a laborer, and had risen the ranks as a caretaker, and he was still residing in that space. His visa was still attached to the architecture, and that idea was also, one of the early researchers in terms of the theme, so he becomes a protagonist for the piece that I eventually made. So just sharing how, the ways things happen is based on movement, physical, and thinking, and reading, and writing, and reaching out to the poets, working in different languages, and developing the work from multiple perspectives. And that idea of this kinetic, interdisciplinary space is again coming back to how I think of my practice as a somebody who draws all the time. So in that time of doing this large-scale work, I was also really in thinking about the idea of the pixel as something that was a unit that could be thought of in a very dynamic manner. So the dynamism of the pixel starts to emerge as a parallel to the unit of a mosaic. So when I got the opportunity to work at Princeton University, I was thinking, how do I work in a medium that has longevity, and it can also involve the materiality of glass, something that is fluid and transparent and permanent and full of possibilities of light and visibility, invisibility, all these different things that I myself was exploring through the use of film and light projections, and thinking also in terms of their relationship to drawing. But here are some other sort of iterations of how animation can be seen in so many different ways, where it functions as not just a work within the confines of a museum, but also outside with live performances. It has a score that is often created in partnership with the composer, but local poets. And then when it finds its way into the relationship between mosaic and glass, it takes on a different idea and offers a whole different way of engaging with that thinking through the drawing. So the materiality of glass, its fragility, opaqueness, transparency, malleability, they become a stand-in for the concept of drawing. So here I had thought of the scroll, which was very cinematic in the 3-channel works that I was making, and then when I turned it upside down, it becomes this stacked up compositional structure, which allows a very different interplay of color, shape, form, and it offers it allows me to think about the human economic interconnectivity with references to history, religion, literature, and all of these concepts are present in the piece that I'm talking about, which is called Ecstasy as Sublime, Heart as Vector. And these are some drawings that I did to scale. So these are all sometimes at 14 feet, but the piece itself was almost 70 feet. So this animation, mosaic, projections are naturally moving in the direction of time and space, and I become more interested in how art can function in public domain. And that sort of leads me into works that I was able to do, recent works at the Madison Square Park, for example. I had been working with mosaic, so here are close details. So you can see that some of this work can function both as a conversation with the drawings and with the paintings, but then when you come up close, you can also see that it sort of is it deconstructs that idea in a way which allows it to exist outside of the page and outside of the museum into a public space. And here is a fountain that is in Princeton, and here you can see some other versions coming to mosaic. Yeah, here is the piece that I was mentioning, which was at the Madison Square Park. So here, I was thinking again how could I use my painting into sculpture. So you can see how I'm taking the kind of the idea of the skirt, which was very present in the early paintings, and thinking about the skirt as a space which was a collective space, a stretchable, expandable space for the female and her carrying her baggage, and then allowing it to exist as this idea where it has a translucency and its architectural properties are connected to the ceiling that is in the nearby courthouse. So I was looking at the Maitland Armstrong stained ceiling glass dome and thinking of how that can influence the skirt, and thinking about the stained glass and the mosaic as another way of bringing a relationship to the work that I was going to make outside, and also second part of it was going to be on the roof of the courthouse where it currently resides. So here's some back studio photos of the mosaic, which wraps around the skirt, but it says Hawa, which means breath and to breathe, but also can translate into Eve. And here is the piece on the roof of the courthouse. So I remember standing on the street level, looking up at the courthouse and thinking about how all these figurative sculptures of the famous male philosophers and lawgivers looked so much alike, and often in a state of despair, and this eerie similarity, and that there was an empty spot, and that vacancy screamed for a female representation. So this 8-foot sculpture, which is in bronze, and which resides there, it has this sort of root-like things where it's self-rooted, the feminine is self-rooted, but it's also the invisible roots of the lotus that lie below the depth of the water that are echoed into the roots of the feminine form. So you can see that she arrived on her own plinth. I didn't want to use the existing plinth. So it was also the circular bloom, the petal within petal formation, the arabesque of it, but also the other forms alluding to perception, illusion. You know, it's symbolic of a deeper truth. The lotus has a plethora of meanings and abstract ideas, humility, awakening, clarity. All of that is referencing in the piece. But it's really connected to a drawing I did. So here is the first drawing that I made. So I was really excited to be able to just narrow the essence of the idea through drawing and then be able to expand it into a three-dimensional space. So while I was at the courthouse, I was also really tickled by this idea of the power or the law. The image of the feminine and the law is often the woman with the sword. And many years ago, before 9/11, actually, I was commissioned by a law firm in New York, and I was making work. I was spending weeks there, and then suddenly they had a problem with the image that it was suddenly seen as violent. And so 20 years later, it's just like poetic justice that I have that same form, but in a sculpture on the roof of the courthouse. So I just find that also that who gets to determine what the artist's work is, what is the language, and you know, as a visual artist, so much of the time you're creating things, and then you are in the process of resolving and solving and creating, coming up with solutions in the space of the studio. And then once the work enters a public space, it's a whole different ballgame of who gets to write about it or where it gets incorporated. And oftentimes, so much of the art world focuses so much on identity and on nation-based categories for artists that, you know, then what is it that, as an artist, what is it that I can do to push back at that? So I was looking again at some of the older works, like this portrait, and then that becomes the premise for this, the work here. So I just wanted to share that because it's not Medusa. It was both these sculptures wear decorative jabots at the neckline, which was referring to the accessory popularized by the U.S. Supreme Court Associate Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and the feminization of the black judicial robes traditionally worn by male justices of the courthouse. So I'm looking also at the African and Asian histories of hair, and hair has been of interest to me, and masks, etc. Just wanted to mention that because there was a lot of conversation around the demonic horns. Anyway, so that was also, I did a project with Snapchat so that we could bring the sculpture from the roof into the garden and be able to have access to it. So the questions at the core of my interest in shifting the painting into the realm of the sculpture were around the issue of time. How can art remain valid over time across different languages, geographies, histories? Where does the power lie in an image? How is time visualized in an artwork? Does art create new ways to experience time? How can a painting erode its historically produced reality, its value-giving mediated structures? What role does repatriation of objects with suspect provenance play in the accountability of museums? Can it determine how and what we see? How are beliefs tied to reproduction of cultural knowledge? I see that I have a minute left, so I'm going to sort of narrow this down and just say that I can't show the remaining PowerPoint, but the older I get, the more I see that the enmeshed space between art and life, both are messy, complicated, fraught, they happen, they survive, they inspire. The continuity of art and knowledge construction is an anchor for me and for my practice. How we reckon with our otherness in a shifting world, how we approximate, reproduce, and reenact our culture and history. Whatever we make, consume, and give back, it has resonance and consequence beyond our immediate lives. So how we experience creativity, how we respond to it, and how we interpret it is such an open-ended premise. So as an artist, I like to believe that the function of art should and has to allow multiple meanings and possibilities, that it has to open up space for a more just world. And it's in that sentiment that I like to create something which is wondrous, and it has all sorts of possible associations that I'm not afraid if different interpretations happen to the work, but that's something that the work can generate thought and it can produce difference. So thank you for that, and thank you for your time. I am more than happy to answer any questions. If there's anybody that has any comment, please feel free.
So I have two questions. The first one is the piece that was hanging in the middle of the gallery at RISD, and we only saw one side of it. So I was wondering what was on the other side, because it was right in the middle of the gallery.
So on the other side was a framed work. It was a large drawing from the mural that I was sharing that I was doing at the Skadden Arps law firm, and then I was asked to exit. So it was a piece from that series, an incomplete work.
So that was hanging on a wall then, because I thought that was just free-flowing.
Yes,
and
so
then you would have seen it the other side.
The installation was only on one wall.
Yeah, okay. The second thing is, I'm very interested in how you transitioned to the mosaics. And do you have other people working on these mosaics, and how did you learn how to do the mosaics?
Yes, so the first time that I did the mosaic was with the Fran studio in Munich, and I met them at Princeton University, and they had been working with the Stone brothers, and I had just learned that I was I had won the Public Art Commission, so I introduced myself, and I wanted to visit them. So I went there, and that started our long-term partnerships. So I work with them primarily.
Thank you.
Hello. You speak a lot about like thought in regards to time and space. In your work, The Scroll, I'm curious about how you process that thought when time is so difficult to measure, and when you're taking this non-tangible concept and putting it into a still image while still conveying that idea of the movement and the non-endness of time, and how you decide when you want to stop that time, when you stop that story, that scene that's going, this long scene that's happening with your work. Where do you decide that it ends? Do you want it to end, or is the idea that you're leaving the viewer with this concept of the continuous time and how you convey that?
In particular to The Scroll?
Yeah.
Yes. I just want to point out that I was 18 when I was working on that painting. So obviously, it was a very different idea or concept of time anyway as a young person. But in that particular medium, you had to plan out the piece before you even started it. Its execution would take a year of sometimes 14 hours of work daily. But you couldn't just spontaneously keep building it. It had to be structured, and then you go in and fine-tune it and keep adding detail and detail and detail. So that's a very different way of working than, say, something like this, where I work on the floor and then pull the piece up on the wall. So it's done with loose material like ink, and it's much more painterly and developed in a manner which also engages the body differently. Like here, the full body is involved. Over there, in those detailed works, you're sitting on a table with a magnifying glass. So your body is particularly, your eye and hand coordination is at the front. Over here, it's a very different way of going in and out of detail. So in terms of like concept of time and knowing when a painting is done, I think that's something that all artists probably have a different strategy. I often like to revisit older works and paint on them and develop them, and sometimes, there are different things that haven't been resolved that sit, and then even a decade later, you're like, oh, that makes more sense now, and you can build on it. So it's gouache and water-based material, which I feel they're always porous, so you can keep adding or subtracting. In the scroll, the borders are at the top and the bottom. So intentionally, there were no borders on the left and the right. So the idea was that it was a kind of a film or something that could move in time and space. Thank you.
You have done miniatures as well as large-scale works. Would you like to tell us which you find more difficult in the context of the labor that goes into making that piece?
I think even like animated works or these films that I make are very collaborative, and they can take months. And so there's a different time that gets entered, which is there's no shortcut, whichever work. I think because of age, it's harder for me I definitely need a magnifying glass, and it's slower, so I can't work 18 hours a day. I also opted I do all the small miniature paintings myself. I don't have a team of people working on my work. So of course that is another very important understanding of like how if I'm going to sit and make a small detailed manuscript piece and it's going to take me 6 months to a year and I can only make 1 or 2, it's a very different idea than having a studio production where you're not really making the work either. So these are very interesting things that you're bringing up, because so much of this often gets not really talked about in the art world in terms of labor and whose labor. And I like to be very transparent in the collaborative premise of my work. Anybody that I work with is always given credit and their name's always present.
And we have time for one more question, if anyone would like to raise their hand. Oh, up in the balcony?
I wish I had my computer and I could fast forward to some of the image, because I don't want to go through each and every one, but towards the end I was going to show some of the current work that I'm working on for the show in Venice. Do it. No, believe me, it was too ambitious. I don't know how many images I put into this PowerPoint. So if somebody over there is able to fast forward towards the end. But I think right now, like for example, I am working with Pace Editions Paper Mill Studio, which is, I've never really worked with pulp. So working with paper and just paper, pulp, and water is a very different approach to thinking about an image, whether printed or painted on top of the surface of a paper. So here it's like the pulp itself, when you inject color into the pulp, that pulp is allowing, and its relationship to water is allowing me to think of images in a different way. So that really is the material is playing a very beautiful role in how to get to the essence of the material, as well as what image will best come about through the spontaneity of water, or the idea of water into the work, which is different from doing ink drawings that also have a fluid nature and you can't control them and you have to work in a very spontaneous, clear manner. Sometimes when all of that works in place, the image can be very powerful, and sometimes, you're trying and it feels very labored and unresolved. So it's definitely, material does play a role, and I am interested in material a lot. And anytime, even with mosaics, I spend time with the Franz Meer studio in Munich, wanting to really understand the material before, and not just send an image to be made into mosaic, but to really understand what else I could do with the kind of deconstructions happening from within the material, so it doesn't feel like paint by number reproduction of an image of mine, but how could I understand the property and the material of the mosaic, and what else could it offer? So its relationship to animation made it much more appealing to me to work with mosaic. So yeah, coming back to your point, material does play a very important role.
And on that note, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Shahzia, for the wonderful lecture. We do have a public reception in the banquet room following the lecture, so you are all welcome to join that.
Thank you.